On today's show, we preview the UFC 241 main event between UFC heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier and the man he finished to capture the title, Stipe Miocic.
Cormier knocks Miocic down! History! UFC history!
Having lost his belt in devastating fashion at UFC 226, Stipe Miocic now returns to the octagon, steadfast on reclaiming the gold he so covets and re-establishing his reputation as the UFC's most successful heavyweight champion.
It's all over! Stipe Miocic is the new UFC heavyweight champion!
However, as the only UFC fighter to defend titles in two different weight classes, Daniel Cormier will look to cement his legacy as one of the greatest champions in UFC history. Hello and welcome to UFC's Inside the Octagon. John Gooden alongside Dan Hardy, bringing you deep analysis for the biggest fights. And they don't get much bigger than the fight that we're looking at today for the heavyweight championship. Dan, it is obviously between Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic. It's a little bit different to the first time that they fought, this being a rematch. What's your take on this?
Well, the first thing that stands out to me is the fact that Miocic has been relatively silent since the last fight. I mean, that would have been a shock to him. It would have been a real hit on his ego, as well as him being on a real streak at heavyweight. And now he's going to look at Daniel Cormier. I don't think he took Daniel Cormier as seriously as he should in that last fight. And I'm not saying as far as an all-around game, as far as his punching power, for sure. I just don't think he had any problems with Ngannou, who is a big puncher. And I think he looked at DC thinking, well, this guy's going to bring a wrestling offensive to me. I'm not really going to have to worry about the punching too much. And I think that must have been playing on his mind since the last fight.
Yeah, OK, well, we're going to get into it. But first, as we always do, let's pull up some facts and stats around these two big guys. I'm going to highlight this, as we've covered this one before, but I think it's worth talking about that height difference and what that means to this fight, because DC always seems to manage to overcome that reach.
He does, but his style is constantly moving forward, and he has lots of tricks, ways of getting inside people's reach as well. And also, he picks his poison. He knows that if he stands on the outside and tries to find the right opportunity to find his way in, he's probably going to get caught with big punches, whereas if he forces the point and works his way inside, a lot of the times these guys feel quite smothered, and DC's, underneath them before they can really do anything to counter it. And the one thing that stood out to me in the last fight was Miocic doesn't really use his range like he used to. Like, you go back to his earlier fights in the UFC, and he was so good at maintaining distance. But I don't know whether he was more eager. There was not a patience that I was expecting from a defending champion in that fight. So, the height and reach, they just didn't play into the last fight at all.
This is obviously impressive, one of four simultaneous two-division champions in UFC history. But Dan, I think people sometimes miss this. Second longest unbeaten streak in UFC, Strikeforce, Pride, WEC, so all the big organisations as a heavyweight. Yeah. DC's 12-0. Another little nugget, I can't see that he's ever lost a round at heavyweight as well. So, in my eyes, I think we're going to get onto it a bit later, but really I think it's his weight class.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that because he's got the skills and he's big enough to make his skills work in this division. Yeah. But he's not big enough to the point where he starts to slow down the later rounds, which is why he's able to overwhelm some of these heavyweights. Yeah. He moves at a pace that they can't keep up with. His technical abilities at a level where he's able to control the fight with his wrestling and take it wherever his opponent doesn't want the fight to go. And his conditioning is outstanding, and that's something that I was expecting to see in this fight with Miocic. I think both of these fighters were expecting this to be more of a drawn-out battle than it was. Yeah. I even think DC was a bit surprised when he knocked Miocic out so quickly. OK, well, we must take a look at that first fight then and really pick the bones out of it. So over to you. OK. Well, as I was saying, the first thing that stood out, look at the height and reach advantage. You can clearly see that Miocic is the bigger fighter, but he didn't fight like he was the defending champion. For me, the defending champion's like, come and get it. Come and get the belt from me. That's the mentality that he should have had, especially with him being the taller guy. But Miocic went after DC. He was walking his way into the clinch. He wasn't doing anything to maintain a distance from DC and force the point that he's got the longer arms. So in these clinches here, this is DC's warm-up. This is what DC does every day. It's these moments where DC looked uncomfortable to me, where he's up against the fence, realising that he's at a disadvantage of reach. So every time Miocic steps forward here, like that management of distance, I like to see that. But then there were so many times when he stepped in square, like look at that. There's something about the way that he throws his right hand, and I've mentioned it before, and I'm sure that me and Stipe will have a conversation about it at some point. it frustrates me the way he throws his right hand because he's got such a long reach, but he crowds himself. I mean, look how close he is here. There's no need for him to be even in physical contact with DC at that point. He should be feet are square up against the fence, hips are square, shoulders are square. He should be 1 foot out in front of the other. He should be using that lead hand as a problem for DC. Can't get close to me, DC. I've got this hand here all the time. But instead, he would touch him with that, and then he would step in square for his right hand, which just allowed DC to continue working the clinch. And then what we saw with DC is the reaching. I mean, we do need to have a conversation about the eye pokes because I do think that was something that played into the fight, and that is not a jab to me. Sorry, DC, but if you're aiming to jab somebody, the elbow comes out behind the fist. That was a flick. Whether that was a flick to distract him, to do something else or not, fingers should have been guarded, and Miocic paid for it, and it happened a few times in the fight. So that's something else, especially if you're the referee, you've got to be thinking, got to keep an eye on DC for that, because his game is constantly reaching for the hands. And that's not because he wants to grab a hold of his opponent necessarily, it's because he wants to smother their attack. Like with a spinning kick, let me just pause that a second. With a spinning kick, the worst thing to do from a spinning kick is move away from it most of the time. Move into it and smother it so you take the power away. Same with kicks. It works the same at heavyweight with these punches. You know, the lighter weight classes, they work around you as you're reaching, but with heavyweights, with it being slightly more slow and more laboured, DC's able to parry and grab and deflect, and he does a lot of stuff moving his head as well, so things roll off him. So he likes the fact that heavyweights are trying to hit him and not having a lot of success, which allows him then to work into a clinch. And because Miocic felt comfortable in the clinch, that's exactly what happened. He found his way into the clinch. DC automatically goes for the underhook and comes up the other side with a nice short right hook. And I know there's been a lot of celebration about this punch and about this, you know, this particular movement and what happened. And
I got very excited about this, the switching of the arm, and I asked you to detail it for me.
Well, the first thing I think to myself is that this is automatic for DC. I'm just going to pull it back. I'll talk you through what I'm seeing here. OK. So they've stepped into the clinch here. Again, Miocic just far too close to DC. DC's got the arm around the back of his neck, which tells me that he's not particularly bothered about being in the clinch with Miocic, because any good wrestler is not going to opt to give an overhook. But what DC knows in this circumstance is if he offers Miocic an overhook, Miocic is going to take it, which then engages him in the clinch. So now Miocic has stepped into the clinch. He's like, now we're clinched. Now, there's something that happens automatically with DC here, and we spoke about it with Henry Cejudo, the principle over method approach to wrestling. I would imagine, even if you walked up to DC in the street and you put your arm around him and grabbed him tight waist, he's going to dig an underhook, automatically.
Right.
I guarantee it, because watch this. As soon as Miocic goes to grab that far waist, here we go, he's got that far waist now, so now DC feels they're close. He also feels vulnerable because he's got the underhook, he's given the underhook, which means that in a wrestling sense, Miocic can level change and attack that knee straight away. Right? He's dropped down, he's got that knee.
Yep.
I'm not saying he's going to, but DC automatically recognises that, which is why we see the left arm, it loops it beautifully, it comes over the head, it comes underneath, and that allows him to step through, bang. Do you see what I mean? I don't think necessarily that the underhook to the punch, it was the same thought process. It was the grab, I'll get my underhook, and I'll throw a punch while I'm stepping. And I don't think he meant to knock him out cold like that.
I think he's given himself space in order to put in a huge punch which knocks him down rather than dirty boxing.
Absolutely, he created space by doing it, but I think he created space because he felt the vulnerability of the underhook, not because he wanted to throw the punch.
Yeah.
The reality is if he hadn't have dug the underhook, he wouldn't have been able to hit with any power because he would have been jamming his own
We've
punch.
seen that against Jones.
Exactly.
As well.
So swimming the underhook's a natural thing for him to do, and what it allowed him to do was to swim underneath and then step off his right leg, and come over the top, which accentuated the power.
Whichever way we look at it, it's genius. And it's beautiful.
It is.
So now we have that body of work, those few minutes, so we can critique both of these guys. And let's put a spotlight on Miocic for a second then. So he told ESPN's Brett Okamoto that he was happy with the way that the fight was going, and DC won the lottery with that punch that we've just looked at. If you are Team Stipe, do you subscribe to those thoughts?
No. Not even if I'm Stipe's coach and I truly believe that was the case, I can't let my fighter believe that, because then there's nothing to be learned from that previous fight. Like, the first thing I need to do is go, hey, you got knocked out, you need to take ownership of why that happened, because it happened. You got caught with a punch and you were knocked unconscious. So whatever happened in the build-up to that, we need to assess it, and you need to take ownership for it, because that's the way that you grow. And if Miocic feels like everything was going right with that fight, then we can probably expect the same thing to happen again. I think he'd be expecting the power this time, so he might not get knocked out quite as quickly. But really, this is the Miocic that we should see. The UFC debut, standing side on, being a good boxer, a good kickboxer, using that lead hand and those low kicks. If he can maintain this distance with DC, that's going to force DC to panic a little bit, to start walking forward. And if you're constantly moving back and moving away, like, you can force people to walk onto shots. He's a Golden Gloves boxing champion. We forget this about Miocic. I actually feel like his right hand is almost holding him back now. Whereas if you look at him early on, he was a far better boxer. You look at the opponents he's fought. With Roy Nelson, he respected his power. With Struve, he expected his reach. With Gonzaga, he expected his takedowns and his ground game. So all three of those people, he was like, I'll keep away from this person. I'll keep away from this guy. But with DC, I just don't feel like he had that concern that DC was going to do anything other than try and wrestle him to a decision. I just want to see him be a bit more calm, a bit less aggressive about taking the belt back off DC. It almost needs to act like he's defending the belt. Like he's the one that's got the belt to be given away to DC, and then DC's got to come and take it. Because if we get Miocic on his toes moving back, forcing DC to come to him, that's when his reach advantage comes into play. That's when you can predict that DC's moving in a straight line towards you, because DC's footwork's not wonderful cutting people off as a striker. His footwork's great in a wrestling clinch, but on the outside, DC does tend to follow. Watch the John Jones fight. He follows John Jones around, which is why Jones is able to walk him onto the head kick. You know what I mean? It's like, there are so many different ways for Miocic to find his way into this fight, but he has to stick to a game plan. And I don't feel like he did that in the first fight. And if he did, it was the wrong game plan.
Let's switch it over to DC then. Now, when I looked at this fight, I put it in slow motion, and early on, I spotted this pattern where DC's almost like a mummy, walking forward for an extended period of time, and it rang alarm bells for me. But as we saw the fight develop, it's like, my God, this is genius. He's, you know, he's encouraging Stipe into this range, which then led to the finish. Do you agree with that? Do you think that was a good part of the game plan for him?
I think it's the only option that DC's got. The benefit in walking himself into range with his hands up and guard high is that he's going to catch the punch much sooner than he would if it was here. Yeah. If you're walking towards someone and you're taking punches here, they've got an extra 30 or 40% of momentum to gather in the punch.
GSP used to hold his guard out quite far.
Yeah, quite a lot. I mean, there are a lot of people that do it. You know, like a lot of the time, you would meet the guard with the lead hand. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of different martial arts that do that. Yeah. And we're seeing it more in MMA than anything. Conor, you look at Conor's lead hand. It's always right out there in front of your face. John Jones is the same. So I feel like the traditional boxing guard and standing in punching range, it's not necessarily applicable to MMA anymore. And I feel like DC's aware of this, and because he's got the wrestling to back it up, he's able to walk himself into range. Right. So I think smothering the punches and having his hands on the outside as well, he kind of builds this frame around his head, and then he moves his head inside that frame to get away from stuff. But that also makes his opponents commit to punches because they're missing stuff, which then allows him underhooks and that kind of thing. I think it's a very strategic thing that he does. And I think in the fights that we've seen him be effective with it, it's almost like, what's his opponent thinking being in that range? You know, we saw it against John Jones, stepping into range. We know Jones likes to fight his opponent's fights. Yeah, you break the clinch and you move away from DC, but he's only going to come back at you and try and get his hands on you. So you've got to do something to stop him moving forward, which is where Stipe's jab comes into play. This DC is a wrecking ball for anybody. And because he's shorter and because he's got such a heavy upper body and a good grip, he's able to hang on these taller guys, break their posture, wear them down. Gustafsson's a great boxer, couldn't get away from DC. And when we see DC put his punches together really well, like he did against Pat Cummins, we did see that DC's got punching power. I just feel like moving up to heavyweight, it accentuates that power because he's not having to cut the weight, he's not having to drain himself, he's got more body mass to put behind the punches, which when you see him switch from one foot to the other and throw a punch, that's 260 pounds of weight that's behind that punch instead of, a depleted 210, 215. Yeah. Makes a big difference.
Yeah. Great stuff, Dan. I'm going to hold you there. There's plenty more still to come. That will be coming up after the break. Welcome back to UFC's Inside the Octagon. So in part one, we were talking about a theme that I was getting from Dan, where Miocic maybe needs to demonstrate some patience. Then we went on to the clinch work that appeared for DC and the power that he's carried up to heavyweights. But what, Dan, do you think that Stipe needs to do to kind of avoid some of those potholes that he found out in the first fights?
Well, the first thing is that he can guarantee DC's going to come to wrestle. DC is not going to decide he wants to be Anderson Silva in this fight and stand on the outside and kickbox. That's not the way that DC fights. So you can kind of build a game plan that's on relatively secure ground, that you've got to deal with a shorter guy that's going to throw bombs over the top and try and get in on your legs and take you to the floor. So then Miocic builds his game plan off that. And as we were saying early on, he needs to maintain that distance. He's going to have to defend some takedowns. He's going to have to defend some takedowns because that's the only way that DC wins this fight, in my opinion. Unless, obviously, he catches him in the clinch again, which I would say Miocic is going to be a bit more wise to that in the future. Like, his takedown defense against Gonzaga shows the respect that he had for Gonzaga's ground game. He also shows that he knows exactly where he wins this fight against Gonzaga. And I think he needs to be more realistic about where he beats DC. By going back and saying, I beat DC everywhere, you're discounting where you could win the fight easier. And where he wins the fight easier is at range. So defending takedowns, staying on the outside, chopping at the legs a little bit is going to be useful. But Miocic has just done this for 25 minutes against Ngannou. He can wrestle hard for 25 minutes. So if he's able to get out of those first 2 rounds without taking too many heavy shots in the clinch, he's able to defend some takedowns. I'm not even suggesting that he can't reverse it on DC and start working the clinch. I mean, he did take DC down in the first round. DC went for that headlock and got bullied over, and then he gave his back. So Miocic finds himself in this position where he holds a person, he weighs on them heavy like he does on all of his opponents that he wants to grapple, and he beats them up and he wears on them. And like DC as a heavyweight over 25 minutes, unbeaten at heavyweight, obviously. But facing someone like Miocic, who's at that level that can put the fight together almost as well as DC can in every range, I would say that's where the size advantage comes into play for Miocic. And I think that as long as he approaches it smart, I think he can use his wrestling later in the fight to an advantage in an aggressive way.
So DC doesn't win this fight by clinch, let's just say that. And what does he have to fall back on?
Well, this is where the cycle starts. This is where DC's ultimate game plan comes into play. And he shows up every day into the octagon. Whoever he's fighting, there's my game plan. What are you going to do about it? Because he's so good at it, people can't stop it. And because there's no real out in this game plan, people find themselves caught in this cycle. I call it the grind cycle. He embraces the grind. And he forces his opponents to not embrace the grind. None of these guys are embracing this grind. They're all hating this grind. It's a horrible place to be because DC chain wrestles so well. He smothers people. He breaks them down. I mean, to lift Anthony Johnson like that, and then we've talked about it before, he drops them in their clamps. So immediately there's weight on top of you when you're disorientated. When you just landed, you've got weight on you. And then he's quite happy staying in the top position. He loves half guard. He loves chopping away with short elbows, like he did against Lewis, like he did against Johnson. He takes them down, he beats them up to the point where they then start to turn away. They start to give their back, and then he sinks his hooks in. And he's not even really that concerned about chasing the rear naked choke straight away. If he's in the first round and takes the back and doesn't feel like you're vulnerable enough, he'll just beat you up for a while. So then the cycle is, you get taken down, you get beaten up until you give your back, DC takes your back, and then you either stand up with him on your back or you get choked out. But as soon as you're back to your feet, DC's taking you down again.
Yeah.
So that's the cycle that's repeated. You're half guard, you get elbowed to bits, you turn your back, he jumps on your back, he starts to choke you out. And that's a cycle I would say that DC can replicate. And I'll go as far as to say, this looked like a warm-up fight for DC. It didn't even look like he was putting a great deal of effort in against Lewis, like playing with him, ankle picks and stuff. So it's so easy to upset the balance of some of these heavyweights, especially when he's been fighting guys like Gustafsson and Jones, who can scramble and can move and can wrestle. When you've got someone like Derek Lewis, who's got ridiculously heavy hands, but he's about as mobile as a truck, you lift that one leg off the floor and those guys are falling down when John Jones is hopping and elbowing you at the same time. So I would say that DC's work in this weight class is probably easier, even though he's dealing with bigger guys. The difference here is he's dealing with a bigger guy that's not Derek Lewis. He's dealing with a bigger guy that can wrestle and can box and has been a champion and does know how to defend the title. It's all about Miocic showing up and being realistic about what he brings to the table in the DC fight and knowing what DC is going to try and do to him and then sticking to a game plan because that's what DC is so good at. And that's where I feel like Miocic struggled in the first fight.
So let's think about then both teams going into this one and the tape study, what they've seen. DC said on a mic, I think, that they had spotted that when Stipe was retracting from the clinch, that he was coming out with his chin held up, and that led to the eventual knockout. But going into this one then, what will the teams have seen that they might be able to exploit?
Well, this is where I feel that DC's at a disadvantage because I think he felt the first fight was so easy. Then he went on to defend against Lewis, which was relatively easy as well. And what he's been saying in the press conference is he's just not good enough to beat me. which feels to me a little bit like the opposite way around in the first fight. I don't think Miocic thought DC could knock him out in the clinch with one punch. So I think there's a lot of expectations in this that will change sides. I think
weird,
now,
isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Because now I think Miocic is the one coming in going, right, I know he can knock me out in the clinch now. I know he can wrestle hard for 25 minutes. So I've got to give him that respect. DC's coming in going, well, I beat him once. It was quite easy. I think I'll just do it again, exactly the same. So I actually think that Miocic is the one that's going to be doing the research. So DC said he does the tape study. He sees Miocic pulling out of the clinch with his chin up. They're patterns that you can spot if you watch any fighter. And if I'm Miocic, if I'm Miocic's coach, I'm watching DC's fights for those patterns. Because as good as a fighter is, everyone has them. The better fighters, they're more difficult to spot, but they've still got them. But this pattern that DC's got is asking for a setup. I mean, it's so consistent. This is one clip against Volkan Oezdemir. He does the same thing 6 times. I'm just going to pull it back just a little bit so you can see what I'm saying. He has this pattern when he's dealing with big punches, right? He sees the lead hand coming, and he goes away from the lead hand. And then he sees the right hand coming, he dips to the side. So you can see him moving back there. He knows his opponent's coming, so he goes back away from the lead hand, which means that they miss that one. They're committing going forward, so then the right hand comes over the top. But by this time, DC's gone back, and then he ducks down to the side. He puts his head right down there, because the benefit here is that he throws the jab, and then the right hand goes over the top. DC's no longer there, his head's down there, and his opponent's fully extended with square hips ready for taking down, or at least come up into a clinch.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it works for him. It works so well because he knows where the safe pockets are to put his head. It's like when you're boxing, like there are certain safe places to put your head when you're rolling. Certain places you don't want to put your head at all.
And he goes into the danger zone a lot.
Always in the danger zone. He has to get into the danger zone because he's always fighting guys that are bigger than him. But his ability in these ranges to be able to slip to one side and the other does draw people on. The difference is when you have got someone that can read it and they can adapt and sees those patterns. Like, for all the research that DC did and the patterns that he's seen in Miocic, if Miocic is doing the tape research as well, or his coaches are doing the research, the information's there to see. Everyone has patterns that can be exploited. And DC's just, he's a competitor. He knows the value of doing his research and being prepared. And it concerns me that Miocic has come out of the last fight saying, I've not watched it yet. I'll watch it at some point, but I've not watched it yet. Because in his head, he's probably built a scenario that happened in that fight that's not realistic. So he's not got a realistic place to start working from to prepare for the next one. For me, if I've got a fighter that gets knocked out, we're sitting down the next day and we're watching that. And we're not attaching any emotion to it. We're not going, oh, that was terrible, you got knocked out in front of 6 million people, you lost your title, all that. It's not important. It's a martial arts contest. This guy was better than you on that day, and we need to figure out what that margin of error that was that created the win for him. I just hope that Miocic's team have done that and they've not just kind of gone with the, we were winning the fight until the lottery punch landed, because that's not what happened.
It's a big one.
It is.
And I like the fact that this time they're a little bit gnarly. That relationship is not quite as it was in that first fight. Thank you very much, Dan.
I like it.
Yeah, he is.
I like an angry Miocic.
An angry Miocic. Well, we'll see how that one plays out. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode. Keep the conversation going using the hashtag Inside the Octagon. Tweet at UFC Europe. And we will see you next time. Thanks again for watching.